The discovery of the structure of DNA was amazing,
That's right, it was.
but it didn't really tell us about how genes work.
What? It didn't?
So that's where a molecule called RNA comes in. RNA was the key to figuring out how genes in DNA actually work. A little side note. So, today we're going to be learning about RNA, but the big picture over the next couple weeks is we're going to learn how proteins are made. DNA has all the instructions for making proteins, but RNA is a big part of how those proteins actually get made. So that's why we're taking a day to just learn some about RNA. Remember that the monomer, or building block, of DNA is called a nucleotide. Now, RNA is also made up of nucleotides, but there's a few main differences to know between RNA and DNA. So nucleotides are made up of three parts. Remember, we have the phosphate, the sugar, and then the base. So the sugar is different between RNA and DNA. In RNA, this sugar is called ribose. In DNA, it's called deoxyribose. So that's why RNA is the letters RNA, because it stands for ribonucleic acid instead of deoxyribonucleic acid. The second difference between RNA and DNA is how many strands they're made up of. So here's DNA, a model of it, and you can see that it's made up of two strands. So there's two sides of it, and they're held together by those base pairing rules, by those hydrogen bonds in between the bases. But RNA is actually made up of only a single strand, like this. So instead of being double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded. The last main difference is that one of their nitrogen bases are different. So if you remember from last week and the week before, we learned about the 4 bases in DNA. There is cytosine, guanine, adenine, and thymine. Now 3 of those are the same in RNA. We still have cytosine, we still have guanine, we still have adenine, but in place of thymine, there's uracil, or U. So the base pairing rules then for RNA to DNA, so if we have DNA that has A, T, G, C, the strand of RNA that would pair to that, we wouldn't have a T here, we would have a U, then an A, C, G, following those base pairing rules, okay? So uracil replaces thymine when it's RNA. Now you might be wondering to yourself, why is RNA important? Well, I'll tell you why. RNA is important because our DNA, which has all the instructions for making proteins in our cells, it stays in the nucleus, okay? But RNA can carry the message of DNA out to other organelles in the cell, like the ribosomes, where proteins are made. So it's very important because it can carry DNA's instructions out of the nucleus. And we'll learn exactly how that happens in coming weeks. But know this for now, RNA is very important. Okay, so there's 3 types of RNA. Right now we'll get a brief overview of the 3, but we'll learn a lot more about how each of them works in the future. So first, oh no, my pen is unplugged. So the first type of RNA is called messenger RNA. or sometimes we will abbreviate this mRNA. And what this does is it carries instructions from DNA to other parts of the cell. So as you're filling in your table, that's what you can put. This carries instructions from DNA to other parts of the cell. So that's the first type of RNA. Now, another type of RNA is called ribosomal RNA, or rRNA. Now, this type of RNA makes up the ribosomes. So that's what you can put down. This makes up the ribosomes. And if you remember from last semester, the ribosomes are where proteins are built. So our next couple weeks are going to be all about how are the instructions in DNA used to make proteins. But the ribosomes are where proteins are made. And then this last type of RNA is called transfer RNA, or tRNA. You can remember that because it kind of looks like a T shape, right? So what transfer RNA does is it brings amino acids to the ribosomes to make proteins. So that's what you can put down. This brings amino acids to the ribosomes to make proteins. And so we'll get to learn about each of these steps, but right now we're just learning about these key players, as it were, these different RNA types of RNA. So that's all.